This is the visual guide for my Heidi Cardigan knit pattern. This is a very beginner-friendly project with a very simple boxy shape, which is slightly oversized, slightly cropped, and has this sort of drop shoulder shaping. It's worked from the bottom of the back to the top and then over the shoulders down the front. You're then going to pick up stitches for the button band, for the collar, and work the sleeves in the round. The only thing you're going to need to seam for this cardigan is the sides of the body, otherwise the construction is all in one piece. I would say this video is more of a visual guide. You will still need the written pattern to go alongside it. Apart from a few exceptions, I don't give any specific stitch or row counts, so you will need the written pattern to give you those exact numbers. I've disabled the ads on this video, so you should be able to watch this video completely undisturbed, skip forward, skip back, and I make no further monetary profit besides the pattern purchase. So this is a tutorial in the sense that I go through every single section, every single technique, etc. But I won't be giving you the exact stitch counts or the amount of row repeats that you will need for your different sizes. There are timestamps for every section, so you can easily find the section that you're working on in the pattern. And I think that is everything I have to say. We're just going to go straight in, starting from the top of the pattern, talking about the yarn, the gauge. And yeah, I hope you enjoy making this. I hope this visual guide is helpful, especially if this is your very first knit project. Hopefully this will just give you that sort of visual guidance alongside the written pattern. For my cardigan, I'll be using the Drops Nepal yarn, which is an Aran weight yarn. And in order to figure out how much yarn you need, you first of all need to take your bust measurements. For that, you simply put your measuring tape around the widest area of your bust. You can then look for your measurement within the brackets and see what size you equate to. For example, I'm a 93 centimeter bust, so I'm going to be knitting a size 3. I can then check how many meters and yards of this yarn I will need. So I'll need about 969 meters. One skein of this yarn is 75 meters. So 969 divided by 75 equates to 12.92. So I'm just going to round up and I'll need a total of 13 skeins of this yarn. I'll be doing a 2-stripe version, so I'll just be doing half of the amount in brown and half the amount in blue. The next thing you'll want to do is make a gauge swatch, and for this you want to aim for 13 stitches by 20 rows. So I made this one with the recommended needle size of 5.5 mil, and if we measure this across 10 centimeters, so from here, we've actually got 16 stitches, which is way too many. So I experimented by going up a needle size and ended up with this one. I actually haven't blocked this swatch. As you can see, this is nice and flat, whereas, you know, this is a bit crinkled. And you always want to block your gauge swatches, or at least treat your gauge swatch as you would your final piece. So if you think you're going to block and wash your final cardigan, then you should do the same with your gauge swatch. In order to meet gauge for this swatch, I had to up my needle size to a 7 mil, which means that my smaller needle size will be a 5 mil instead of a 3.5 mil. So the needle size will most likely be different for every single person. Use the recommended needle size as a guide and the gauge as a must. As long as you're hitting gauge, it doesn't matter which needle size you're using to achieve this. I'm going to start with the brown colour for the bottom hem. So I'm just getting that ready for my long tail cast on, and my larger needle size for the long tail cast on as well. And I'm just going to cast on the amount of stitches given within the bracket for my size. All the stitch and row amounts for your size will be in the brackets in the same layout as the sizes provided right at the beginning when you measured your bust measurements. If the amount of numbers that are provided for every single size gets confusing, it does help to go through the pattern in advance and just highlight all the stitch and row amounts for your specific size, so your eyes don't get too confused by all the different numbers that are being given. Then after the cast on, changing to my smaller needle, I now do the knit 1, purl 1 row, which you are going to repeat for the given amount to create the bottom hem. And yeah, I'm just going to repeat that across this row and repeat this row like I said, for the required amount. So I've finished knitting the hem in the knit one purl one pattern, and I've changed my needle back to my larger size. So now I'm just going to knit every single stitch of this row. Then at the end of this row, I will turn as usual and change my needle here as well to the larger size. And now we purl every single stitch of this row. Your purl side is the wrong side of the project, so this will be the side facing you or your skin, and your knit rows represent the right sides. So that's the side that will be facing outwards and that will be seen by everyone else when you're wearing it. This is now where I want to change colours, and I linked a tutorial on the second page of the pattern on how to do that. This is the way that I do. I just create a slip knot with my second colour, pop it on the left needle, and then I knit that slip knot together with my first stitch of the previous colour, and then I've created my first stitch with my blue colour, and I'm just going to knit again every single stitch of this row. I've done my 2 rows of the blue colour, so now I'm going to change back to my brown. And this is where we're going to sort of wrap the yarn so that you don't have to cut your yarn after every single colour change. That would create way too many ends to weave in. So I'm just going to take the brown from behind the blue colour. So my blue is here, my brown is here, holding the blue still sort of taut. I'm going to just make a knit stitch with my brown colour. I'm going to knit 2 rows of the brown and I'll show you the colour change again. I'm back again to change my colour back to blue. So I'm going to lay the brown yarn across and bring the blue yarn up from behind, make a stitch, and I make my next stitch. I'll show you again how they look later on once I've kind of made a bit more progress in my fabric here. But now you're just going to repeat the knit row and the purl row for the total amount of rows given in the pattern, and I'm going to do just that and check in again with you once I've made some progress. All right, I am back with the bottom half of my back panel. You can at this point add length to your bottom panel, and to help you figure out whether or not you want your cardigan to be a bit longer, you can take the measurement C from the schematic right at the bottom of the pattern and determine whether you want that measurement to be a bit longer. If you do, you can add a few more rows onto here. If not, don't worry about it, just skip to the next instruction. Now, I forgot to do this and I've already moved on to do my increases for the armholes. However, once you've knit the bottom of your back panel, you need to place a stitch marker into the very first and the last stitch of your most recent row, and these are going to mark the bottom of your armholes and will be used later on when we pick up the stitches for the arms. Like I said, just ignore the fact that I've already made a few rows extra. Luckily this pattern is very forgiving, so I'm able to add these stitch markers now as well. So at this point, for sizes 1 to 3 we'll be doing some increases for the armholes, and sizes 5 to 10 some decreases. Size 4 won't need any armhole shaping, so you can just continue to the next instruction under all sizes. First of all, I'll show you how to do the increases for sizes 1 to 3, and then I'll show you how to do the decreases for sizes 5 to 10. So to increase for the armholes, you're just going to knit the first stitch, and then you're going to knit the front and the back of the next stitch. So you're going to knit as usual, and then you're going to insert your right needle into the back of that exact same stitch and make another knit stitch. So you would have created 2 stitches within one, and that created 1 increase. Then we're just going to knit until the last 2 stitches of this row. Now I have 2 stitches left on my row here. I'm going to repeat the knit front and back stitch. So I'm going to knit as usual, and again insert your right needle in the same stitch around the back and make a second knit stitch, and then you're just going to knit the last stitch. So you've now created an increase right at the end and at the beginning here. The next row is just a simple purl row, no increases, and you're going to repeat this however many times the pattern calls for. So let's say the pattern tells you to repeat the increase knit row and the normal purl row another 7 times. So you want a total of 8 increases on this side and 8 increases on that side. Now to increase for sizes 5 to 10, you are going to knit the first 2 stitches as you would normally, and then you're going to knit together the next 2 stitches. So you're going to insert your right needle into 2 loops on your left needle and knit those together. So that way you would have just decreased 1 stitch because you only have 3 loops on your needle here. And then you're going to knit the whole row until the last 4 stitches are left. Okay, so I have 4 stitches left on my left needle, and this time we're going to slip, slip, knit in order to decrease. So you want to slip this stitch, slip the next one, and you put them back onto your left needle and make a knit stitch through those, and then you just knit the last 2 stitches. So maybe you can see here the decreased stitch is now leaning to that side, so it mirrors the knit 2 together that you did on the other side. As with sizes 1 to 3, you're going to simply purl the next row, no increases, and you're going to repeat your knit increase row followed by your normal purl row however many times the pattern calls for. So if, for example, for your size, the pattern asks you to repeat these 2 rows 1 more time, you're going to do exactly that, and you want to end up with 2 decreases on this side and 2 decreases on the other side. So I've done my increases for the armholes, and I can now continue knitting the rest of the back panel. So for this, you're just going to knit and stockinette for however many rows are needed for your size, meaning you're going to do a knit row followed by a purl row followed by a knit row followed by a purl row, and so on. So I have finished my entire back panel, and you would have finished on a knit row, so your next row and my next row will be a purl row. So you're simply going to purl however many stitches are required for your size. There we go. And then all these remaining stitches you're going to put on hold. So you can grab your darning needle and some scrap yarn and put all of those stitches on hold. Okay, so my working stitches are here, and these are all the stitches that I put on hold. My colour change is now happening on the inside of my knit piece rather than on the outside where we've been changing the colours here. This will vary depending on where you start your stripes. So obviously at the bottom here, I did 2 rows of my first stripe in stockinette. If I had done only 1 of the brown and then moved on to the blue, this would have worked out differently, and it would have been easier to change the colours on this side. But sometimes it's hard to think ahead, so I'll show you how I changed the colours on the inside here as well, in case you've got the same situation. So I'm just going to join the yarn again as usual and knit the first stitch together with the new slip knot, and I'm just going to knit all the way to the end of this row. And you're just going to repeat purling 1 row, knitting 1 row, another 4 times, so for another 8 rows. And whenever you get to the side where you're changing colour, as before, you just bring up the previous yarn up and continue knitting with that. The next row needs to be purled all the way until the end, and then we're going to backward loop cast on 2 additional stitches, which will create the shaping for the front neck. Now this is the side where I'm changing my colours. So in order to not have a super long float here from the colour that you're going to change to on the next row, you're going to just wrap the bottom yarn over your current yarn and cast on 1 and wrap it back the opposite way and cast on your 2nd stitch. So now the colour that you're going to change to on your next row sits right at the top. So if I'm going to flick over, this is where I'm now going to change my colour, and the yarn that I'm going to change to is right here. So I'm just going to knit the first additional cast on stitch, knit the second, and continue knitting the row. So you can see here, these are the 2 additional stitches here. So you're going to knit until the end of the row, purl until the end of the row, and cast on 2 stitches again for however many times the pattern tells you to repeat this for. I'm going to show you the colour change again as well on my next cast on row. So here we are again at the end of the purl row, and I'm now going to cast on 2 more stitches. So I'm going to wrap the bottom yarn over the current yarn, backward loop cast on 1 stitch, and wrap the bottom yarn back over my current yarn and backward loop cast on the 2nd stitch, and then I'm going to turn, and for this knit row I'm going to change the colour over. So now you can see sort of where the shaping is happening, and you also don't have any long floats kind of carried here. Your stripe pattern might be slightly different and you might need to change colours. Like I said, still on the outside, that's a lot easier, but also it's not a big deal if you have to change colours here. Hopefully the sort of wrapping method makes sense there. So I'm just going to continue my amount of cast on repeats, and I'll meet you back for the next instruction. Once again, we finished on a knit row, so the next row is a purl row, and in the same way as you've done before, you're just going to purl to the end of this row, and then you'll need to cast on some additional stitches. For sizes 3 and 4 you won't need to cast on any more stitches, and for all other sizes the amount of stitches you need to cast on will vary. So for my size I don't actually need to cast on any more stitches, but if your size needs more stitches added then you can do so now. Once you've done that, you're just going to knit the next row, purl the next row, and repeat the knit and purl row for the repeat amount given in the patterns. If you want to count the amount of rows you have for your front piece, then you're going to count from the first additional cast on row. So for me this is from here. So any amount of rows or row repeats you want to count, they go from this point onwards and down. This is how the side looks after I've done a few rows of colour changes, and you can sort of see these are the floats that are along the sides, and it is barely noticeable. Plus you will also either seam along the side here, or for the armholes you're going to pick up stitches along here for the sleeves, so it really won't be visible. This time you would have finished on a purl row, so this time you would have finished on a purl row, and I've done all the rows needed for the first front sort of section. And now for sizes 1 to 3, we're going to do increases along this side here. Size 4 won't need any armhole shaping, so again for that size you can ignore the next sort of increase decrease instructions, and you can just continue to where the pattern tells you to continue to. For sizes 5 to 10 we'll be doing some increases again along this side. So here you've got the sort of inside where your neckline is, and this will be your hem, and this is your outside. So this is where the armhole is, which is why we're doing the increases and decreases here. Sizes 1 to 3 are going to knit until the last 4 stitches of this row. Sizes 5 to 10 are going to knit until the last 3 stitches. Okay, I've got 4 stitches left here. And then to decrease, I'm simply going to knit 2 stitches together like so, and knit the next 2 stitches. So the next row you're just going to purl, and then the following row you're going to decrease again, and you're going to repeat the decrease knit row and the normal purl row however many times the pattern calls for. Now for sizes 5 to 10 I would have knit until the last 3 stitches here, and we're going to create an increase. So for that we're going to do a KFB stitch. So knit, but don't take it off your left needle, and knit into the back of that exact same stitch. So you would have created 2 stitches where there would have normally been 1, and then you're just going to knit the next 2. As with sizes 1 to 3 as well, you're going to purl the next row and then repeat the increase knit row and the normal purl row however many times the pattern calls for. So I'm going to do just that, and we'll meet again when we've done all the increases or decreases needed for the armholes. Armhole shaping is done, so for the next row you're simply going to knit all the way until the end, and right at the last stitch is where you're going to add a stitch marker to mark the bottom of the armhole in the same way that you did on your back panel. Now all you need to do is continue knitting in stockinette until you get to the hem of the body. When working the back panel, if you added any more rows to extend the length, you'll need to add the same amount of rows to this section here. So I've finished knitting my whole front panel. This is where the neck shaping is, and then around here somewhere is where my armhole shaping is. And now it's time to do the hem. For this we're going to just do a simple knit 1, purl 1, ribbing stitch pattern, the same as you did for the start of the back panel. The exact stitch variation will vary slightly for some of the sizes, so just have a look at the pattern which stitch variation you need to follow. I am actually going to just simply knit the whole first row, just because my first row is a colour change row, and I can quickly show you how this will look if I now knit 1, purl 1 this row. You have the purl bumps show up as the colour change purl bumps, and I don't really want that. So like I said, I'm going to knit the first row, just simple knit row, and then I'm going to adhere to the ribbing stitch pattern. This is just a personal preference. You can and probably most likely will simply just adhere to the pattern and do the ribbing stitch pattern. Make sure to also go down in needle size. You don't want to be doing the whole hem and then realise you didn't change your needle size. So just for demonstration purposes, I'm just quickly going to knit the first row, like I said, in stockinette, and then I will show you how the ribbing looks. Okay, here we go. So now I'm simply going to knit 1 and purl 1 and knit 1 and purl 1. And now I can also show you on this side there's no blue sort of purl bumps, and I'm just now going to do 8 rows of ribbing rather than 9, because the sort of knit row counts as one of the hem rows, even though I didn't like rib that row, if that makes sense. For sizes 4, 6, 7 and 9, the stitch variation for the ribbing varies slightly. On the right side rows, you're always going to start and finish with a purl stitch, and on the wrong side rows, you're always going to start and end with a knit stitch. So when the hem is finished, all you now need to do is cast it off, and you're going to cast off in pattern, meaning you're going to cast off in the rib pattern, and we'll cast off with the larger needle again. It will just create a slightly stretchier cast off. And a good tip is that you don't actually need to attach your cable to the needle. You can simply just take this needle as is like that to cast off. So we're going to do a standard bind off, and like I said, we're going to do it in pattern. So I'm going to knit the first stitch, purl the second stitch, and then I'm going to transfer the first stitch back on my left needle and slide my second stitch underneath. So I've just cast off the first stitch, and we're just going to repeat that. So knit the next stitch and pass it over to cast off, purl the next stitch and pass over to cast off. Again, for things like the cast off method, I have a video linked on the second page of the pattern, so you can have a look at that in detail as well if you want to have a better look at how to cast off things like this. But yeah, I'm just going to continue this until the end, and then we would have finished the first front panel. I always find that after doing the slog, that is the back panel, doing the front panels feels like such a breeze because you're only knitting so many stitches per row. So yeah, this is where we're at, and we're now going to do the front right panel. So with your larger needles back on your cables, you're going to pick up an amount of stitches for the front right panel, and there's a certain amount of stitches that's going to stay put on hold, which we will pick up later on for the collar. So count the amount of stitches that you're going to knit for your first rows, starting to count from the armhole edge of the back panel, and you're going to put all of those stitches back on your needles. This is a little bit fiddly, but yeah, you just want to make sure that you grab every single loop that has been put on hold and put them back onto your needles. So now if we look at it from the back panel, we have the front left, which you've already worked. You have your middle stitches on hold, which will be picked up later for the collar, and you have your front right panels back on your needles. So we're going to start with a knit row and just join the yarn back on here. And yeah, we will knit in stockinette for the amount of rows that the pattern calls for, the same amount of rows that we did for the front left panel. And then we're going to once again backward loop, cast on additional stitches, but I'll show you once I've made my section here. Okay, I got kind of carried away and I'm already knitting the next row after the repeats. And at the end of this row, we're going to do the first backward loop cast on. So I'm just going to make my way all the way to the end. And same thing as on the other side, I also need to change colours on the next row. So I'm going to lay the bottom colour over my current one, backward loop cast on one, and then put the bottom yarn back over my current yarn, backward loop cast on the second stitch, and then now I can turn around and I can purl the next row with my new colour. So I've purled the first cast on stitch, the second one, and then now I can just make my way back down this row. And yeah, again, here you can see the extra cast on stitches are just here. So same thing as on the left hand side, but now we are casting on the knit row rather than the purl row, and I will show you how to continue on from there. I've done all the cast on repeats and the next row is a knit row. At the end of this row, I personally, for my size, don't need to cast on any more stitches, but you might need to, so you're going to do just that. And afterwards, you're going to knit in stockinette for, again, however many rows the pattern tells you to. So we're basically knitting the top front section, and I'm just going to knit in stockinette until we get to the point where we either are going to increase or decrease for the armholes. I finished all of my row repeats and I finished on a knit row. So the next row is, of course, a purl row, and we're actually going to do the increases / decreases for the armhole on the purl row this time. So this is a bit different, and for sizes 1 to 3, you're going to purl until the last 4 stitches. And for sizes 5 to 10, you're going to purl until the last 3 stitches. Size 4, as usual, doesn't need any armhole shaping, so you can just continue to the next step. But for sizes 1 to 3, I'll show you first. I'm going to purl until the last 4 stitches here. All right, here we go. We've got 4 stitches, and to decrease, I'm simply going to purl these 2 stitches together, and I'm going to purl the last 2 stitches. So we've decreased 1 stitch. It's always easier, I find, to see on the knit side. We've decreased this stitch here. For sizes 5 to 10, you purl until the last 3 stitches, and you're going to purl the front and back of your next stitch. So you purl 1, and then you also purl through the back loop of that exact same stitch, and then you purl the last 2 stitches here. So you would have added an additional stitch right there. The next row is just a normal knit row, and as always you're going to repeat the increase/decrease purl row followed by the normal knit row however many more times the pattern tells you to. And as always, I'm going to just quickly do that. I've done all my armhole shaping rows, so I'm just going to change colour for the next row, which is a purl row. And at the end of this row is where we're going to place the stitch marker into the very last stitch that we would have worked to mark the bottom of the armhole again. And then this is where we're just going to continue knitting in stockinette all the way down until you meet the hem. Again, remember, if you are adding more rows to your body, then obviously do the same on this side again, otherwise your cardigan will be a little bit lopsided. But yeah, just simply going down in stockinette now, and then we will do the hem together. Here's my stitch marker for the bottom of the armhole, and then at the top here is where my neckline shaping is. So now, once again, it is time to do the hem. And I'm going to do the adjustment again of just purling this time the first row of the hem, so I can avoid those purl bumps. But of course, if you're either not doing stripes or your stripe pattern is working out differently, then this is where you're going to start by knitting 1 and purling 1. Also, you know, keeping in mind whether your size requires slight sort of stitch pattern variations. But yeah, I'm just going to purl until the end, and this purl row is going to count as my first row of the hem. And now for the remaining 8 rows of the hem, I'm going to do the knit 1, purl 1 ribbing. So yeah, gonna just keep doing that for the total amount of rows until it's time to bind off again. And now, just as before, we're going to take the larger needle to cast off. So again, we're going to bind off in pattern. So I'm going to knit 1, purl 1. This might be purl 1, knit 1 for some of the other sizes. But yeah, then I'm just going to cast off the first stitch, knit a stitch, cast off the previous one, purl, and cast off, and I'm going to do that until the end of the row. If we look at it from this way, we've got the back panel, stitches put on hold for the neckline, the left front side, the right front panel, and we're now going to add the trim for the button band. So we're going to start on the right button band. So if I spin this around, this is my right front panel. With your smaller needles again, you're going to join the yarn right at the bottom here of the hem. So I'm just going to thread my yarn through there, and then you want to pick up stitches along here to create the button band. This is a bit of a trial and error, and you might have to readjust. I've made many of these and I still have to kind of readjust the increments in which I'm picking up the stitches. You'll see how many stitches you will need to have in total. Roughly, that means picking up 2 stitches for every 3 rows, but like I said, it might need a bit of adjusting. So for the ribbing, this is quite tricky actually to show you because I'm using the same yarn colour as I did here, but essentially you're going to pick up a stitch for every row. However, these increments, like I said, it will probably be 2 stitches every 3 rows. So I'm picking up 1 stitch, 1 row, 1 stitch, 1 row, and then I'm actually going to skip the next row and go into the next, pick up a stitch, pick up a stitch, skip the next one, pick up a stitch, pick up a stitch, and I skip the next one and I pick 2, skip the next, pick up 2. I would recommend just continuing to count as you're picking stitches up, and you will kind of be able to tell as you get into the end whether you've got enough stitches or not, and you might have to just go back and pick up stitches in a different increment. As long as you're picking up the required amount of stitches sort of spread out across here, you don't want to pick up like most of your stitches up here and only have a few here. You kind of want to even it out across the entire thing. So I only need to add 2 more stitches to my button band, but I still have like 6 rows left up here and I don't want to have all this like bunched together. So I'm actually going to go back sort of halfway, I think. So take my needle out of these stitches and work it back. So now I know that for a few times I will have to pick up maybe 2 stitches every 4 rows rather than 3 to just space things out a little bit, and then I can reassess whether these stitches kind of line up. Okay, I managed it. That worked out quite well. So now I'm just going to turn my work and do a very simple knit 1, purl 1 rib pattern. And I'm going to do that for the total amount of rows given in the pattern. So here is my trim for the right button band. And just as we did for the bottom hem of the right and the front panel, I'm going to take our larger needle to then cast off in pattern. So knit 1, purl 1, cast off the stitch, knit 1, cast off, purl 1, cast off, and do so for the whole right button band. So with the right button band all cast off, it's time to cast on the left button band, and for that we're going to start casting on at the last front neck cast on that you made. So I'm just going to add my first loop there and start picking up stitches just as you've done for the right button band. On this left button band, we're actually going to create the buttonholes. So you're going to knit 1, purl 1 as you've done before, but only for a total of 4 rows. So I'm going to do that and then I'll show you what to do next. Then you're going to take your stitch markers and we're going to place them to mark where the buttonholes are going to be created on the next row. So you want about 3 centimeters sort of from the edge, which measures roughly sort of 5 stitches. So I'm going to put my first stitch marker up here and I want the same at the bottom, about 3 centimeters from the bottom edge. So I'll do the same again here. I'll count 5 stitches and place a stitch marker there. So that way I've already placed 2 of my markers and the remaining 4 you can space out as roughly as you want or as accurately. You can count all these stitches in the middle here and sort of divide them by the 4 stitch markers that need to go in there. The good thing about removable stitch markers is that you can place them, count, replace them until you're happy with your stitch marker placements. All right, I'm happy with my stitch marker placements, so we're gonna continue on with the next row, and this is where we're going to integrate a new stitch to create the buttonholes. So you want to work in pattern, meaning the knit 1, purl 1 pattern. So I'm going to knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit up to the stitch marker. Then I'm going to yarn over. I can remove the stitch marker and knit the next 2 stitches together. And you're just going to repeat that. So I will knit in the rib pattern all the way up to the stitch marker. Here we go. Yarn over, remove the stitch marker and knit the next 2 stitches together. And yeah, just repeat that for every single stitch marker until you reach the end of the row. Then after this, you're just going to knit in your rib pattern for another 4 rows. On the first row, you are also going to work your yarn overs. So I'm 1 stitch in front of my yarn over here. This is my yarn over. I'm going to purl the next stitch, knit my yarn over, purl the next stitch, knit my yarn over. So I'm still working in the same knit 1, purl 1 pattern, and I've also created the buttonhole here. I'll show you again, so I'll just knit 1, purl 1 up to the next yarn over. Here we go, purl the last stitch before the yarn over, knit the yarn over, purl the next stitch. Depending on where you've placed your stitch markers, you might have to purl the yarn over, but that doesn't matter. You just want to make sure that you're continuing your knit 1, purl 1 stitch pattern as you've done before. But yeah, like I said, you just want to do this for a total of 4 more rows, so you have the same row amount as your right button band. And then you're going to take your larger needles again and bind off in pattern, again like you've done for the right button band. And yeah, we'll meet back here. So now we've done both the button bands, it is time to cast on for the neckline. This has a few different parts of where we're going to pick up the stitches. So again, as with all ribbing sort of trim areas, we're going to use our smaller needle size, and you're going to join the yarn at the top right button band, and you need to pick up 10 stitches along the top of the right button band. This first stitch counts as part of that, so I'm doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I'm picking up 1 stitch per row, plus also the cast off row that we did. Then the amount of stitches to be picked up along the neckline shaping is going to vary per size, but you essentially want to pick up those stitches along this edge where you did the additional cast on stitches. So for my size, I need to cast on 8 stitches in this section. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, and if I can find it, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. There we go. And then we're going to pick up 10 stitches along the shoulder here. So we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Then you're going to take your left needle and you're going to place all those stitches that you previously put on hold onto your left needle, starting from the outside, so the needles join back here together. So for that, I'm just going to flip this around and try and locate all of the stitches that I previously put on hold, and you can then also remove the scrap yarn. Now I've got the back of the neck stitches on my left needle here, and this next section is a little trickier, but it will help make sure that there's no weird sort of gaps or holes when connecting these two sort of shoulder and neck section. So we're going to pick up 2 additional stitches in between these 2 stitches here, and for that you're going to pick up the purl bump of the stitch below. So this stitch here, I want the purl bump at the back, so I'm going to pick this up, just pop it on my left needle, and I'm going to knit this, and I'm going to do the same for this stitch here, which sits below this stitch on my left needle. So I'm going to find the purl bump behind it, pop it on my left needle and knit it. So that way you can see how we've closed this gap between these two sections, and that will mean that you don't have any awkward sort of holes or gaps here. Then you're just going to knit all the stitches that you previously put on hold that are already back on your left needle. This part is very easy. And then we're going to do the same here for the section. So you're going to grab the purl bump of the stitch below. You're going to knit that, and then you're just going to identify the stitch sort of in line with the stitch that you just picked up. Grab the purl bump and put it back on your left needle. There we go. And knit that one again. And then you're already back on the shoulder sort of side of the other side of your cardigan. And you're going to, again, pick up 10 stitches along here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And the same stitch amount as you previously did along the cast on neckline here where the neckline shaping is. So again, for me, I need to pick up 8 stitches along here. So I will go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And then you've just got the 10 stitches along the button band here. So I will go right in the first sort of ribbing row there, and that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. There we go. So just count all of your stitches and make sure you've got the right stitch amount for your size listed in the pattern. And then you're going to knit 1, purl 1, the same as we've done for the button bands, the same as we've done for the front panel hems. And then when you're binding off, you do not take your larger needles. You're just going to bind off with your small needles, just because you want the sort of collar to sit quite nicely around your neckline. So I'm going to do that, and then we can check back in. All right, now it is time to do the sleeves. And for that, we're going to pick up stitches in between these stitch markers. So you're going to join the yarn at the first stitch marker along the side of the body. So this one, because you want the right side, meaning the knit stitch side facing you. And you're going to leave a very long tail, about 70 centimeters, and we're going to use that tail later on to sew the sides of the body together. So I'm just going to create a slip knot, and with your larger needles, again, we're going to, like I said, join here at the first stitch. There we go. And a good tip for when you're working in the round, which is what we're going to do, to have a smaller needle as your left needle. It will make feeding these stitches through a lot easier. I'll show you this in a sec. If you are struggling to work in the round, especially when you're working with stripes, it can be quite a lot. You can also just work the sleeves flat and sew them together at the end. I won't be giving instructions for this, but you can literally just follow the instructions as they are. But yeah, like I said, instead of joining in the round, you're just working flat. So you need to pick up your stitch amount between this stitch marker and this stitch marker, so all the way along here. That equates to roughly 2 stitches every 3 rows. I have to sort of alternate picking up 2 stitches every 3 or every 4 rows. So you might just have to, again, experiment a little bit. It does help to just space them out. So I know that roughly here at the shoulder stitches is my halfway point. So I'm just going to divide the total amount of stitches that I need to pick up for the sleeves in half. And I know that 1/2 needs to be picked up here and 1/2 needs to be picked up here. So that way I can easily check and I don't have to pick up stitches the entire time and then realize there isn't enough or there's too many. And it also just helps pick up the stitches more evenly as well. If you know that you've evenly picked up half the amount of stitches here, then you can do the same on the other half. When you have all your stitches picked up for the sleeve, we're then going to join in the round. The cable that I've got on here is quite long. I would usually use a shorter cable. It's just currently stuck in another knit project. A shorter cable will make working in the round much easier because you don't constantly have to pull the cable through. So you'll see here, I'm kind of pushing the stitches off so I can pull the cable so that then the stitches land on my left needle. So yeah, definitely grab a shorter cable than what I'm using here. And then to join in the round, you're just going to knit the first stitch and every other stitch after that. There is no purling, nothing, you're just knitting every single row. You want to kind of hold the tension quite tight here, but also don't be too worried about there sort of being quite a wide gap under the sleeve. We're going to tighten all of that up with your long tail that you left. That's what that's there for. We're going to make this all nice and snug, but yeah, you still want to kind of hold the stitches, at least for the first couple rows, a bit tighter around the first and the last stitch where you've joined in the round. You can place a stitch marker between the first stitch and the last stitch of the round to mark where the start of the round is, especially if you're working with just one colour. That can be quite helpful. You do, however, also have quite a sort of clear line here, like you know that this side is the start of the row, this is the end of the row. So I'm lazy and I don't always put a stitch marker. Later, when I've worked up quite a few rounds, I would just kind of trace between the stitches and I'll know where my round has started. With working with stripe, the start and end of your round will be much more obvious, which you will see in a second. But I'm just going to make my way to the end of the round and then I'll show you how to change colour as well. And you can see actually here how loose the stitches still are, even though I'm holding quite a tight tension. So like I said, if the same is happening to you, don't panic. We can fix that when we're sewing the sides together. So now I'm back to my first stitch of the round and I'm going to join my new colour, and I'm simply joining it as I've done before. You just want to make sure that you're kind of holding everything quite tight, like I said, for the first couple stitches. And I'm just going to knit all the way around for the first round. I'm coming to the end of the round, and here you can see why it's so much easier when you're working with stripes to see the start and the end of the round just based on where the colours change. I've made my last stitch here. This loop's getting quite loose, so I'm just gonna pull that very tight underneath. And now, in order to make a joinless colour change, again, there is a link on page 2 of a more detailed tutorial on how to do this. But basically, to make the second row of your current colour, you're going to bring up the stitch below onto your left needle and you're going to knit those 2 stitches together. As you're doing this, I haven't fully pulled the stitch off yet because I just want to pull everything tight, especially pull on the yarn over here. Just make it nice and tight, and then as you're holding everything nice and tight, continue knitting the second row of your current colour. After you've done a few stitches, you can also just pull on the strands again just to make sure that everything is definitely tight. And yeah, just continue knitting till the end of the round. I'm back at the start of the round and I need to change back to my brown colour. For that, we're now going to wrap the yarn sort of over the blue. So you see how I'm kind of twisting them. You want to just make sure that your current colour is over the colour that you're bringing up to change to. So I'm making the first stitch and I'm just pulling on everything to make sure it's tight. I'm making a few more stitches just like that and just go back and pull tight on everything. And I've now finished the round, and I'm going to do this second round. And this is where I like to twist the yarn again, just to make sure that everything is nice and tight. So as I'm going in to make the first stitch of my next round, I'm just wrapping the blue colour back over my current colour and make a stitch, and I just pull on this blue colour. And this just makes sure that the gap between the two rounds is super tight. You might also notice that here the transition between the two rows is getting much tighter and neater than at the bottom here. And the bottom, like I said, we can sew together. Okay, changing back to blue. Remember, we're going to fold the current yarn over to the yarn that you want to change to. So there's a crossover here, and I'm just going to make a normal knit stitch, pull the old colour quite nice and tight, and knit this row as usual. I fold this yarn back over my current yarn, and then when it comes to making the second row of my current colour, I bring up the stitch below onto my left needle, and I knit those two stitches together, and I fold over the old yarn over my current yarn, and I make a stitch, make a couple more, make sure everything is held nice and tight. And if you're wondering why we're wrapping the yarn, it just means that there is no gaps in between the sort of colour changed stitches. And you will also see where you're bringing up the yarn, you're creating sort of one V stitch where there's otherwise two. Obviously 2 rows, 2 V stitches, but because you bring in the yarn up for each colour change stitch, you're just creating one V knit stitch. For sizes 1 to 4, you're just going to knit all the way until it's time to knit the hems. There are no sleeve shapings for these sizes. For sizes 5 to 10, you're going to knit in the round for 29 rows, and then you're going to create some decreases. For size 5, there's only 1 decrease round. For sizes 6 to 10, there's a few more decrease round repeats, but I'm going to knit to 29 rounds, and then I'll show you how you create those decreases. So I've knit my 29 rows. I'm in the middle of a stripe, so I've already brought up the stitch below and folded my yarn over. So you're just going to knit the first stitch of this next round, and then we're going to decrease. So the first decrease, you're going to knit 2 together, there you go, and then you're going to knit until the last 3 stitches of this round. So I've got 3 stitches left here of the round. The next decrease is going to be a slip knit. So I slip this stitch, slip the next, put them back on my left needle, and I knit them together, and then I'll just knit the last stitch. So you would have decreased 1 stitch at the start of the round and 1 stitch at the end of the round. For size 5, that's all you needed to do. You can now just continue without doing any more decreases until it's time to do the hem. For sizes 6 to 10, you'll do the normal knit rounds for a certain amount, and then you're going to repeat the decrease rows for a certain amount as well. So simply follow the round repeat instruction for those. And then right at the end, you can just double check your stitches as well to make sure that you've decreased the right amount just before we do the cuffs. You have the option right at the end before moving on to the cuffs to check your sleeve length. If you're someone who kind of tends to struggle with sleeves being too short, you might want to add some rows, or equally, if the sleeve is kind of feeling too long when you're trying on your cardigan at this point, you might want to remove some of the rows. The sleeves do change quite a lot after blocking. They kind of tend to maybe stretch out a bit more than the body would because you have all of this weight kind of, gravity is falling down. So if you want to be 100% sure that you are happy with the length of your sleeve and you want to avoid having to later on after you've blocked your whole cardigan to undo the cuff to, reduce some rows, you can put all of your stitches on hold, sew the sides together as I will show you shortly, and block the entire cardigan and see how the length sort of fits. It's just an option. Otherwise, if this is too confusing, don't worry about it at all. You can just move on to the cuffs. Okay, my sleeve is done. So now I've changed back my working needle, my right needle, to my smaller size so we can do the ribbing. And to start with, we're going to decrease. So for the first 2 stitches, we're going to knit them together. The next 2 stitches, we're going to purl together. So we're already creating the knit 1, purl 1 rib pattern, but we're also decreasing at the same time to make a smaller cuff. So I'll show you again. These 2 stitches, going to knit together, and the next 2 stitches you will purl together. And you're just going to make your way around the entire round until you're back at the beginning. Now you've already established your knit 1, purl 1 stitch pattern, so you can just continue working in the round, knitting 1 and purling 1, and you're going to do that for a total of 9 rows, the same as you did for all the other hems. So I'm gonna just go ahead and do that. Now the last thing to do is grab your larger needle to do the cast off in pattern again. So once again, you're going to knit 1 and purl 1, and you're going to slip the stitch over, knit 1, slip the stitch over, purl 1, slip the stitch over, and just continue to do so until you've cast off every single stitch. So with one arm finished, you're just going to do the exact same thing on the other side, pick up the stitches, knit the sleeve, do the cuff. And then once you've done that, it is time to sew together the sides of the cardigan. So for this, you want to grab your darning needle and you're going to thread the long tail that you left right at the sleeve join and just thread that through your needle. To sew the sides together, you're going to use the mattress stitch. As with all different techniques, there is a tutorial linked on page 2, but I'll just show you how I like to make sure that especially the hole right under the armpit stays nice and snug. I'm just going to remove these stitch markers. So the mattress stitch traditionally would start where your yarn sort of starts, but I like to go up a little bit before I go down. So I'm just going to do a stitch opposite where I've joined my yarn and pull that nice and tight. And then I'm going to go up, pull that nice and tight and go the opposite way as well. This really doesn't have to be perfect. You might see I'm really not doing it particularly neat. This will be under your armpit, so it's not going to be super obvious, but yeah, you just want to make sure that there's no hole. So already this is looking a lot better. I might just go up one more stitch just to be on the safe side. All right, now I can't really see any large holes, so I'm going to make my way back down so I can then sew the sides of the body together. So for my stripe pattern, I can actually see if I hold the hems together. So the sides of my stripes are not going to line up like this. They need to be like that. That's going to help me when I'm sewing the sides together to make sure that I'm sewing them in the right increments. So I will pick the first stitch here and go around the adjacent stitch on the other side and make sure that's nice and tight, not too tight where it kind of holds a weird tension, but just tight enough so that there aren't any gaps. And I'm just going to go all the way down the side of the body, always just checking that all the stitches are joined in the correct way. So you can see here, these are the opposite stitches there. If you're ever unsure whether your tension is too tight along the side, I always just like to stretch this out a little bit and you should be able to feel the strands kind of extending. And you can see, even though this is stretched out, the gap here is barely visible. So yeah, just give it a good stretch every now and again. Once you've sewn the sides together, you just need to weave in all of the ends, and then it's time to block your cardigan. This is where the real magic happens. Your yarn will ease up, your stitches and your tension will relax, and I'll show you quickly how I block all of my cardigans. It's a super uncomplicated way to do it, but there's again lots of other resources online on how to block your knitted garments. So I just used a large wash basket and fill it with lukewarm water. You don't want it to be too hot because you can create shrinking and felting. You'd rather just be on the cold side. Sometimes I also just block with completely cold water, but this time I went full lukewarm. Fill it up so that you can fully immerse the cardigan in there. Don't aggravate the fabric too much. You can see I'm just very loosely dunking the cardigan underwater. You do want to make sure that everything is fully getting soaked, that every single stitch is getting the water that it needs, and then leave it in there for, I don't know, half an hour. You can leave it for 2 hours if you want, but I usually find half an hour does the job. Then you rinse all the water out. This was quite hard for me to show whilst also filming, but you want to scrunch the water out again without aggravating it too much. So initially I find it's enough to just hold the cardigan, let the water drip out, and then start to very gently squeeze as much water out as you can. I then lay it out on a towel. Again, when you're laying it out, make sure you're not stretching anything too much. Be very careful with it. And then you roll everything up and again squeeze. You can stand on it, you can fold it as tightly as you need to again squeeze as much water out as possible. The more water you squeeze out at this point, the quicker the drying process will be. Luckily for me, it was a sunny day, so I was able to lay the cardigan out on my drying rack out in the sunshine, but it does still take a couple of days to fully dry. Make sure your cardigan is fully dry to the touch before trying it on. If you try it on while still wet, it will stretch out a lot more. I actually realized on this try on that my sleeves stretched out way too much. Remember at the start when I said I didn't block my gauge swatch? Yeah, this is where I'm now having problems because I wasn't able to anticipate how much this yarn is going to stretch out, and it stretched out quite a lot in the body as well. I don't mind it so much in the body because the fit is already quite cropped, so it just added a little bit more length on, but in the sleeves I do prefer a shorter sleeve. So I will be frogging the sleeves back, and I'll show you how you can make those adjustments if you have the same problem. But before that, I'm actually going to attach the buttons because I find that can affect the overall fit. So I just want to make sure before I frog anything back that I have a 100% accurate depiction of what the finished cardigan will fit like. So to figure out where you are placing the buttons, you can line up your buttonholes with the side where you need to attach the buttons like this, and then you can place stitch markers through each of those holes. So you just go like this, and then you'll see there is a stitch marker. And obviously you don't want to place the button here because it's too far there. You just want to place it somewhere in the middle. If you want to be more accurate, and this is how I do it, you can sort of count and see visually where the buttonhole is from the bottom. So I can see here, this is a purl stitch, knit stitch, purl stitch, knit stitch, purl, and then the buttonhole has been created on a knit stitch. So I know there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches until I made a hole. So I can count from here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I know I need to place my button in here. And you can do the same for the next one, so you count the stitches in between those two holes. So you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and you do the same here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and the button needs to go in there. For the buttons, you do have a little bit of leeway on the size. The size given in the pattern is the perfect size, but you can go a little bit smaller and a bit bigger. I just wouldn't go much bigger or much smaller than that. And yeah, this is where you can have fun. I always like placing a few different buttons that I have and just seeing how it works with the colour. You obviously do need 6, so that does limit me sometimes, especially if I'm buying the buttons secondhand, on how many I have. And for attaching the buttons, you can use some scrap yarn that you should hopefully have left over from your cardigan. You can do a contrasting colour, of course, but I think I'll probably go for a brown to match the hem colour here. So the first thing we're going to do is to place a lifeline so that when you are frogging things back, you are not just like randomly dropping stitches. I've placed a stitch marker to the row that I want to frog back to. When you flip this the wrong way around, this is also the start of the row is. So then you take your needle with some scrap yarn and go through each individual stitch along this row, and then just go around every now and again. You might want to pull the yarn through, and yeah, just do that until you get to the start. Then when you're back at the start, I'm just going to make a rough knot. This doesn't have to be perfect, you just want to make sure it doesn't open up. So now I've already woven in my ends. This would be easier if I hadn't done that and just waited until the end after I blocked it, but I'm just going to try and find my end to pull back out. The cast off edge might be a little bit hard to frog. I always just like to really pull on it, and then the stitches will kind of magically just undo by themselves. But yeah, the rest you can then just frog all the way, and you don't need to be worried about drop stitches or anything because you've put your lifeline. Once you get to the lifeline, you just won't be able to pull the yarn or frog it any further than where the lifeline is. And here are my stitches now, they are safely on the lifeline. And then from the start of the row, you're going to just pick up those exact stitches, and then once all the stitches are picked up, we can then remove the lifeline. Okay, so I'm going to undo the knot of the lifeline and just pull on one end. There we go, it's out. And now everything's back on my needles. And yeah, I'll just redo the hem. A little bit annoying, but it's always worth taking the time to make those extra adjustments. You will thank yourself later when you're actually able to wear the cardigan. And there you go, your cardigan is all done. You should be so proud of yourself, whether this is your first, your second or third project. This is a big and long project to be working on, so well done for that. I hope you enjoyed working on this project and that this visual guide, this tutorial was helpful. Do tag me in any photos of the finished project. I always like seeing them in real life, and to see that people are actually making my patterns, it really means the absolute world to me. And yeah, I just hope you get lots of wear out of your Heidi cardigan, and that any pattern, any project you work on after this is a breeze.